Hi, I'm Cindy Cushman. I'm co-chairing our gala this year with Vanessa Clark. It is on May 2nd, and I hope that you all have seen the very colorful banners in front of school and in Cressy, and I hope that everybody realizes that May 2nd is next week. It's really coming up. It's surprising some people, I think. But we are so excited about the gala this year. We're going to really entertain you. We have student entertainment that is just going to be amazing. We have a wonderful acoustic guitar player performing after dinner, which is going to be very relaxing. We have beautiful food planned. I think it's just going to be a very relaxing, fun evening. And we hope that everybody in this room will consider coming. Sheila has so kindly put 2 response cards on each table. Just in case you haven't gone online or you haven't put a stamp on that envelope, it's right there. So we really encourage you, just pick up the envelope, fill it out. It's going to be a wonderful night for you, your friends, your husbands, and just support MFA. It's such a great school. We're so lucky to have it. And thank you.
So now I'm going to ask Susan Mudieri, our VP Programs, to get started.
Good afternoon. It is with great pleasure that I have the opportunity to introduce our speaker today, writer Rebecca Makkai. Thank you, Rebecca, for having us. Rebecca Makkai is not only an accomplished Chicago-based writer, she is also a 1995 LFA graduate. Rebecca also happens to live here, right here on campus with her 2 children and husband, John Freeman. Now, I have to admit that when we were deciding on a speaker for the Spring Luncheon and Rebecca's name came up, I was not that familiar with Rebecca's work. Sorry. Until someone said, Rebecca Makkai Freeman. Then did I realize that I did know of Rebecca, as Maddie, my daughter, and many of her Ferry Hall friends babysit the Freeman children. I knew Rebecca as mom to Lydia and Honey. I tell you this story not to embarrass myself, but to point out the many facets of Rebecca Makkai. Now, we all know that she's a wife and mother here at LFA, and also an alumni. But not only is she a very accomplished writer, 2 novels, and a collection of short stories, she also teaches. Rebecca teaches at Lake Forest College and in Sierra Nevada College's MFA program. She also runs Story Studio Chicago's Novel in a Year workshop, and in the fall, she will be visiting the faculty at the Iowa Writers Workshop. Wife, mother, alumni, teacher, writer. Now to her very accomplished writing. Rebecca's first novel, The Borrower, was a Booklist Top 10 debut, which has been translated into 8 languages. It is also an Indie Pick, an O Magazine selection, and one of Chicago Magazine's choices for Best Fiction of 2011. Her short fiction has been chosen for the Best Short Stories for 4 consecutive years, with new stories and essays appearing regularly in journals like Harper's, Tin House, Plowshares, and New England Review. Rebecca's second novel, The 100-Year-Old House, which hopefully many of you had signed today, came out July of 2014. This book was the winner of Chicago Writers Association Novel of the Year and is the story of a haunted family told in reverse. Library Journal calling it stunning, ambitious, readable, and intriguing. Eleanor Henderson, author of 10,000 Saints, states that Rebecca Makkai is the most refreshing kind of writer there is. Both genius and generous, every masterfully crafted connection Every lovingly nestled detail is a gift to the attentive reader. Playful, poignant, and richly rewarding, The 100-Year House is the most absorbing book I've read in ages. Before you finished, you'll want to read it again, and I concur. Her new story collection, Music for Wartime, will appear in July of this year. So when I asked Rebecca how she does it all, she said she could not do it without the help of the LFA community and all those babysitters in Ferry Hall. So now it is with great pleasure that I introduce Rebecca Makkai, who will talk about her fabulous book, The 100-Year-Old House.
I think that before I start, that we have an order of business, which is the bookstore really wonderfully took an early copy, so this something called an ARC, which is an advanced reading copy, kind of paperback early edition of my story collection, which is not out until June. I should know when it's out. It's not out until June. And they wrapped it up to give it away. So someone, and I'm saying this now because in case the dishes get cleared, that will be problematic. Someone has a red dot under their coffee cup, and I really want to see everyone spill their coffee when they look at it. Or under their sauce. It might be under the sauce. Because I could see otherwise having to stop halfway through and yell at them not to clear the dishes. So thank you so much. I love speaking in this room. I love speaking in this house. I love just being in this house. And one of the reasons is that from the time I was a student here at the Academy, this house in particular has fascinated me. And there's something about the fact that it's been used for so many different purposes over its life. I hope that you've all noticed as you walk into different rooms in this house, the photographs that show the way the furniture used to be. I think maybe the early 20s was when those were taken. And part of me has always wished that we could have that for every place we go. That I want to know who, you walk into a building downtown in the city and it might be 150 years old. And you're in the lobby of this hotel, and you're thinking, you can't see what even happened there yesterday or 5 minutes ago. We have no way to know who passed through that room before us. And I've always been obsessed with the idea that if we just had, some kind of wonderful camera that could show us the past just in any one room, if we could have those pictures on the wall of every era of every room, that our lives would be richer knowing what went on in that room before us. In this room, when I was a student here, this is where we had choir concerts and practice. I spent a lot of time here. My cousin got married in this room. And you start to think about, from the time this house was built, the things that would go on that have happened in this room. Some of them we probably don't want to know about, but many of them we would. So that was the part of the impulse that led me to write The 100-Year House. Growing up in this area, having gone to a school like this, but also just everywhere I go, wanting to absorb the history of the place where I am, I've always been fascinated, particularly by places that used to have a different function from the one they have now. And one of the things that intrigued me, one of the elements that I started with when I started writing this novel, and actually I didn't start writing a novel, I started writing a short story probably 10 years ago, and it didn't turn out very well, and I put it aside. And then I finished my first novel. I came back to this short story. I kept trying to change it and make it better. And I finally realized that the problem wasn't needed to be a novel. That I was tapping into such big subjects that I needed more room. So one of the things that started me down this road, though, was the idea of coach houses. And I'm really specifically going to pull up a picture that's not from Lake Forest, because my nightmare, I was like, I could find a picture of a coach house in Lake Forest. It's probably like someone's house in the rim, and that'd be really embarrassing. It's somewhere in England. But this book is set on the North Shore, and I'm going to talk about that. It really is set in Lake Forest. but I never named Lake Forest in here for several reasons. But driving around town, knowing people growing up who had homes with coach houses, this is a space that to me has been fascinating because it is hardly ever anymore used for its original purpose. Back when these houses were built, a lot of them were built right around the turn of the century, right when cars were not only first affordable for people, but also what allowed people to live in the suburbs. If you think about it, this house could not have been here before there were cars. The Armours were really living way far outside of downtown Lake Forest, if you calculate that by horseback or by walking. So these houses were built with these coach houses, and what you see, they've been glassed in. I think those might still be garage doors. But it was a place where you would park your car downstairs, and the chauffeur would live upstairs. And that's really, as far as I know, hardly ever how they're used anymore. People want to drive their own cars. It would be a little weird to, have your chauffeur drive your kids to school every morning. I'm sure someone does that. And so then who lives in the house? It's the nanny or the in-laws. It's someone renting. And I also, as an adult coming back here, I've always been fascinated. There is a coach house to the Armour Estate. I don't want to send you all down there because it'd be a little creepy, but Faculty Circle, when you first drive in, there's a house there that has faculty members living in it that was the coach house to the estate. That was the entrance way back. And is now, one or two family home. So I was fascinated by this idea, and this is basically, I was fascinated by it just as a setting at first. I had in my mind the story of a couple that would be living in this coach house, that the wife in this couple, that her mother owned the estate, was in the larger house, they were in the small one. And then I wanted to make things really uncomfortable by moving another couple into the coach house with them. Because you really, one of the things you want to do to make a story, you want to push people together in ways that they weren't expecting, ways that they're uncomfortable. So the short story that I wrote, for those of you who've read the novel, it has very little to do with the way the novel is now, except that the setting is the same. The short story was about male anorexia, which is nowhere in the novel anymore. That was sort of the subject that I thought I wanted to write about. So I had these two couples living together. The man in the one couple was the only one who noticed that the man in this other couple was anorexic, and no one would believe him, partly because it was a man and because they thought he was jealous. But I loved this setting. And as I went back to the story again and again and again, the setting was what was working for me. In fact, the setting was so much more interesting than the story that I was trying to tell. And after a while, and by a while I mean several years of working on it, I realized that really the setting was the story. The man whose point of view we're in the beginning was, like me, obsessed with the history of what might have gone on in this house earlier. Kept trying to imagine this chauffeur who used to live there and how tired he would have been at the end of the day. They had some furniture even left over from that time, this chair that he thinks the chauffeur must have enjoyed. And so I started to realize that the place itself, the secrets that the place holds, just through time passing, were really the story for me. And that was what the story was going to be about. So I started thinking, at somewhere around this point, it turned from being a house in the middle of nowhere, imaginary land, to being a house somewhere on the North Shore. I didn't want to call it Lake Forest for a couple of reasons. One of them is that there's a college in this town. A character teaches at the college, and some really inappropriate things happen at the college. And I did not, now I actually teach at Lake Forest College. I didn't even then, but I really didn't want that to be Lake Forest College and have it be this, when I say the English department secretary did this, to have that be the actual English department secretary. I left the town without a name. But for anyone who lives in the area, there's enough in there that you would recognize the places. I say things like they cross the train tracks toward the Walgreens, where, maybe if you live in Kenilworth, you could imagine it's about Kenilworth, anywhere on the North Shore, but if you know Lake Forest, you'll understand that it's Lake Forest. So I started thinking for that reason a lot about the history of these towns, why they came to be built, the kind of person who would, sort of like J. Ogden Armour here, decide to leave the city and build this huge estate. And in my case, actually, I have them coming from Canada for several kind of plot reasons. But usually it was people coming from the city to build their estates, and I wanted that history to inform the history of this house. I didn't know yet at this point that I was going to actually go back in time. The way that the novel started, it was just going to be set, first of all, it's going to be set in the present day. And then that's problematic because in the present day, people can Google things, and they have cell phones. It ruins a lot of plots, actually. So I moved it back to 1999. I always wanted to write about the Y2K panic, and so I put it back in 1999. But even so, the novel was all going to be 1999. The more that I thought about the history of the house, the more that I realized that the story was really going to be about people trying to understand the history of the house and what had gone on there before. Finally occurred to me that the narrative actually needed to move back in time. So the way it works now, we start in 1999, then we're in 1955, then we're in 1929, and at the very end, for just a few pages, there's a prologue, which is 1900, when the house was built. I wasn't quite sure of that yet, but I was doing the research on how these suburbs came to be, what had happened, and I'm going to tell you something that I think you probably already know, but it goes into my thinking about the book. So this is a really weird and blurry picture of the Haymarket riots in Chicago in 1886. There was a lot in the city. There was a lot of anti-capitalist, pro-labor union sentimentality. People were fighting for things that we take for granted now, like 8-hour workdays. And long before this, this was starting, and people, these sort of captains of industry who lived in the city, were very nervous about their own safety. They felt personally, that they were going to be personally attacked. And this was kind of the high point of all of that was in the 1880s. This protest that turned into a riot, people were killed, there was a sort of a mockery of a trial, there was a lot of anger. And you got a lot of people before this and then after this deciding that rather than having their beautiful mansion in the city, it might be wiser to move their family up to the suburbs and put a stone wall around their house. They're really literally building castles in a way. So then we get this wonderful train line that's down at the bottom there, which is not so wonderful anymore because it used to go to Milwaukee, and it doesn't anymore. I can't understand how we've regressed in that way. But we have this wonderful North Shore, the Union Pacific line coming up the North Shore, and along that line, these suburbs were built. And people would literally get off the train in sort of uncharted, unincorporated territory and find where they wanted to build their town. I'm sure a lot of you know this, but literally people got off the train at the place where there was a deer path crossing the train tracks and said, let's build our town here. And that's Deer Path Road, and it still crosses the train tracks, which my children think is hilarious. This idea of people building houses here to protect things, to keep things safe, to get away from something else was fascinating to me. I'm always fascinated by why people move where they move and why. My first novel was about runaways and immigrants. And this is in a similar way about people running away from things and trying to construct something safe, but having that fail spectacularly. In my book, the guy who originally built this house, it was only basically to move his wife away from the man she was in love with. It doesn't go very well, and she ends up being, it's kind of, in a way, a ghost story, either figuratively or literally. And if you take that ghost story literally, that wife who was brought to this sort of prison, in a way, on the North Shore is the ghost who then haunts the estate through the following eras. The other thing that suddenly, as I was thinking about the history of this house, it occurred to me there was something else that I'd always wanted to write about, despite at that time knowing nothing about them, and that was artists' colonies. I grew up here, driving by Ragdale, which a lot of you know, right on Green Bay Road. And in fact, when I was a student at LFA, we had some mandatory volunteer days, which we always thought was a lovely oxymoron, paradox. So mandatory volunteer work in the Ragdale Prairie, and we would be picking mustard weed and doing all kinds of wonderful things. I became, despite my adolescent grumbling about the whole thing, I became fascinated with Raddale. I'd never stayed at an artist colony, but this idea of artists living together, working together, what must go on there, it was fascinating to me. And so as I was thinking about what the history of this house would be, it came to me that maybe this really could be a house that used to be an artist colony, and that wasn't anymore. So it has a bit in common with Raddale and Lake Forest, which I'll talk about, but a very opposite history. Raddale wasn't a colony until the 70s or 80s. This one had been an artist colony in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And the first, I realized at that point that I needed to go to an artist colony, partly because I needed to do some legitimate research, also because by this point I had really young children. And so with the help of my husband and my mom who's local and our lovely babysitters who were mentioned earlier, I managed to do a couple of these a year now at this point. This was the first one I went to. This is Yaddo, which is in Saratoga Springs, New York. And it's one of the quintessential artist colonies. If you're ever driving through Saratoga Springs, you can't go in, but there's a beautiful rose garden that you can walk around in. And this one, it started in the 20s, it was one of the first two colonies in the United States. It used to be that a lot of artists would survive on this sort of patronage model. Then around the turn of the 20th century, it switched to this residency model, where I have friends, especially young, single, unattached friends without kids, who live from residency to residency at artist colonies and maybe crash on someone's couch in between and don't have a home for 3 or 4 years because it's funded and they have a studio and they can survive that way. They can live until they get a deal. So this is a beautiful old mansion that now there are. I'll show you. So behind all of these places, and this becomes really essential to my book, behind every single one of these colonies, and there are a lot in America and in Europe, there's an eccentric millionaire. And this was Yaddo's one. Her name was Katrina Trask, and she has this really sad history. She was a poet. They had this beautiful home. They lost all 4 of their children in various ways. Then her husband went blind. Then her husband died in a train crash. In the meantime, their house had burned down, and they rebuilt the house. But you think about like some kind of astrological convergence or something. This poor woman. Before her husband died, they'd had this idea that since they didn't have children to pass their home to, that they would turn it into this artist's colony. And they were kind of inventing the idea of an artist's colony when they came up with this. But she had this vision that there would be people everywhere working and painting and writing. And so when they rebuilt their house after this fire, they built it with that in mind. That is what it is now. This is a group of artists from the 50s. You'll get these amazing photos that you can find online of who was all there at the same time, just posing together for a shot. And this one, it's so fuzzy, but I have to show you this one because it's amazing. So the woman right there, the second from the right, is Carson McCullers, who's a wonderful writer. Right behind her, by the mantle, is Langston Hughes. And then I think Catherine Ann Porter is somewhere in this picture. On the other side of Langston Hughes is this woman who stayed for 5 years because they were harboring her because she was a communist. Long story. There's this heartbreaking story that when Langston Hughes was there, he had to have a special letter of introduction from Yaddo in order to be let into the bar in town. And this was the 40s. They're places, they're very vibrant places. John Cheever, the writer who has had a lot of history at Yaddo, once said that artist colonies, or maybe Yaddo in particular, was like a monastery by day and a cruise ship by night. Which I think is pretty accurate, especially it depends on the group that's there. But during the day, everyone is completely focused on their work, silent. You don't see anyone, you don't hear anyone. If you pass someone, and you just kind of wave and you don't interrupt them. The musicians even often don't like to talk to anyone at breakfast. There's a silent table, because you wake up and you're a musician, you gotta keep that stuff in your ears. But then, by dinner time, depending on the group, it might be just social or it might be chaotic. This is a picture from the 50s. I love this picture. It gets in all the books about Yaddo. This is the writer William H. Gass, and he got painted up for his friend's art lecture at Yaddo about how the brain is a television. So there's bizarre stuff happening, but in a wonderful way. And this is sort of wonderful alchemy that goes on with the arts. And my time there ended up, I'll just turn to a less disturbing picture. This is one of the writing studios out in the woods in Yaddo. My time there and my time at Ragdale later and my time at other residencies, there's one called U-Cross in Wyoming, that's one of my favorites. It not only gives you the time and the space to produce art, but the sort of germination with other people's ideas is really essential. One of the things that ended up in this book is that when I was in my first stay at Yaddo, there was a man there whose art, when I first asked him about it, he said, "I break stuff." When I pinned him down, what that meant, actually, is he breaks sets of china against stone floors, patios, films it with a beautiful high-definition camera, and then makes symphonies out of it by playing it back at different speeds so that the pitch of the breaking dishes changes. And so it's visual, but you also have this auditory, things get repeated again and again, and it's absolutely hypnotic. That it wasn't something I was going to put directly in this book, but it was already writing about people doing mosaics, people using kind of broken things. So I wound up mentioning an artist in the 30s who used to break china and glue it back together. And someone later who's making mosaics in the 90s keeps finding these shards of pottery that are still out in the garden that we later could figure out were from this other artist. So things like that just get into your work and influence the way you see the world, the way you write. It's just some of the other, they keep building new buildings and new studios, just to show you what it's like. And this, I got to go there again this winter. This was my desk. I was writing in this attic in the room where Patricia Highsmith wrote Strangers on a Train, and also where Sylvia Plath wrote The Colossus. So it's kind of intimidating. Like, they haven't changed the furniture or anything. just there. And then just for fun, especially for those of you who either read the book or are planning to, so you can picture what it would be like at a colony, because they got a lot of questions about, is it really like that, and what goes on. This is the dining room at Yaddo. There's also Ragdale, which is right here off of Green Bay Road. You're not supposed to go snoop around and invite yourself in. Sometimes that happens when I'm there. People will be working in their studios, and people will just come up and look in the glass at them like they're animals in the zoo. Please don't do that. They do have open houses and events and all kinds of things. Some of you know this was Howard Van Doren Shaw's own home, the architect. And this one has a completely different history. It wasn't a colony until the 70s or 80s. But like all the other ones, has an eccentric millionaire behind it. And this one also a poet. This is Alice Hayes, who set it up that way. Started inviting her friends first to come stay and produce art, and then turned it into what it is now. But her mother was the sculptor Sylvia Judson, who you might know this statue from the cover of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, that in Savannah, Georgia. There are several copies of it, and this is the one that's right outside of Ragdale. So there was this long artistic legacy to Ragdale. And when I was working on this book at Ragdale, which I did a lot, I felt this incredible energy, particularly there. I'm not a very superstitious person. Things kept happening that were really incredible. One of them was that I was writing about 1955, and I was really bored one day, and I was walking around the living room in their old books, and I pulled an old cookbook off the shelf, and a letter fell out of it. And it was a letter from Alice Hayes home to her mother in 1955. And it had all this stuff in there about, they were living in Boston, and they had to fire their chef, and it had all these recipes, these gross recipes that she said were what they were cooking. And just the way she was talking was amazing. And I did turn the letter in at the office, but before I did that, I copied it. And now, I wrote that in my 1955 section. There's a chef who quits. They hire someone, a sort of incompetent person to cook their food, and they basically have taken these terrible recipes straight out of the letter and put them in there. The other really amazing thing to me that happened when I was at Ragdale is, in the beginning of my book, I keep talking about this infestation of ladybugs. And I was working there, and I had my manuscript. It was printed out. It was the galleys of the book. It was a later visit. And a ladybug flew down and landed on the word ladybug on the page. That was really cool. I mean, there were a lot of ladybugs, so it's not like, but still. Let's talk just a little bit more about some of the research I did. I don't think I'm going to particularly read from the book today unless we run out of questions, because what I'd love to do is have a discussion and you can read the book yourself. But if you guys feel like it, I can read a little bit. But what I want to talk about is what happened next in my process. At the point where I realized that the story needed to be told backwards, it was really frightening for a couple of reasons as an artist. One was I knew I was basically, I would have to do an enormous amount of research to write convincingly about different periods of history, to get the details right. Was going to take a lot of time. You can't just make everything up and rely on your own knowledge of the world. The other thing is that I wanted to write it backwards. I wanted to write it in the order that it would be read. So that means, and I was partway through the first section by this point. So that meant stopping and outlining in great detail everything that would happen. Because I couldn't write the 1955 section without knowing what would happen in 1929. But I didn't want to write that yet. So I ended up with something like a 60-page outline, which is not how I would normally go about writing. But it was a little bit like doing a Sudoku puzzle. You know, one thing would change in one place that would change things everywhere else. So it was this horrible moment of kind of screeching on the brakes, realizing this is what I wanted to do, and then stopping the actual writing process while I did a lot of research and a lot of outlining. The research turned out to be really fun, though. And I get asked about that a lot, so I thought I would show you some of the things. What I realized, you can order the Sears catalog from basically any year off of eBay. And so I got the 1929 and 1955 Sears catalogs, and they were, each one was just this amazing compendium of every single thing that you could buy. A Sears catalog had everything in it. So not only what it was called and what it looked like, but how much it cost. The Sears catalog for 1929 had records in it, LPs in it, and so you could see what the B-side would be, so I have them put on records at one point in 1929, and I'm getting the actual songs. These have been on a record together. A friend of mine was doing research for around the same time period. He was the one who first told me that I should look at the Sears catalogs, and he was amazed as he was looking through this catalog that there were pages and pages and pages of sherbet glasses. And he kept thinking, like, what? I didn't know that sherbet was such a big deal in the 20s. Maybe it's because they had freezers. And then he finally realized they were wine glasses, but it was in the middle of Prohibition. And so Sears catalog cannot sell wine glasses, but they can sell all different shapes of sherbet glasses. So suddenly this became a part of his novel. He thought this was such an amazing detail. For me, it was just, I don't think I had any major breakthroughs like that particular. Well, I had one where there was a paint by number kit in the 1955 catalog. Paint by number had just come into fashion. And I wrote that into my story, and then I also was able to get all the details of what the pictures would have been and what kind, that it was oil paint and all those things. It was also just so useful in the details that in 1929, if you want your characters to sit down on the couch, it's not a couch. Do you know what it is? Yeah, it's Davenport. And the word couldn't come to mind. I'm thinking like it's a settee or a sofa, but you look through, yeah, it's Davenport. I also spent a lot of time, this one has get this off the website, it has something across the front, but this was the actual issue of Picture Play magazine that I got a lot of ideas from. Just trying to order everything I could from that year and do my research. And this one in particular, I just got it because it was the right date. It was the summer of 1929. That's what I wanted to write about. But I became so fascinated by what was going on in the movie industry that I realized that in my 1929 section, where I have all these artists in residence at this artist colony, it would be so fun to have a movie star there. I had to find a reason for her to be there, so she's there writing screenplays. She has an accent, so she can't be in the talkies. She's trying to switch over and survive. And the details from this magazine were just incredible. The gossip about Hollywood. Here's what's great, and this is like my new hobby. I recommend this for anyone it's so much, rather than reading like Us Weekly, it's so much more fun to read these because once you learn who the stars are, then you get really hooked on their story and you can just Wikipedia them and see how they died. And or, you know, you like really like, oh, this, oh, will he ever settle? He's dating her, he's dating her, he's dating her, and then you look at, oh, he was gay. Okay, that's the things, you know, like you have to wait years to find out what's going to happen to Kim Kardashian, but you can find out what happened to Lupe Velez, who had this horrible ending by reading Picture Play magazine and then looking it up. I was especially worried about the research in the 50s. I figured that I would not have that many readers who accurately remembered 1929, but I knew that I would have a lot of readers who accurately remembered 1955. And who, looking at my author photo, could figure out that I didn't, and would be quick to call me out on my mistakes. So, fortunately, some of those people would read in advance for me, like my mother was a great reader, and remembered it was, you know, the year she graduated college, so she knew exactly what things cost and what was available and what sounded wrong, and you know, those years that stick in your memory. The internet was really good for that too. This is a car that I have a lot of stuff on. When you, I'm showing you this partly so that when you read the book, if you read the book, this is the Kaiser this is the car. It's a big deal in 1955, and I loved this. It's such a weird looking car. I just fell in love with it. It was a really unusual, rare car, and just this sort of buttery yellow. That was one of the colors. Bad things happen with this car in the book, unfortunately. Sorry, I'm shutting on this slide because that's the paperback cover. It's coming out in a month, just about, in paperback, but I prefer hardcovers personally. So that was basically, you know, there's a lot more, obviously, to writing a book than just the inspiration and the research. But sometimes I think that's what it's fun to hear about when you have the kind of behind the scenes on the book. I think we all have these guesses when we read something about where a story started, what the origin myth of that novel was. And I think so often we're wrong, because the way our minds work when we think creatively, you start with one little thing and then it goes so far from that, you know, no one would, in their right mind, read this book and then think it must have started as a short story about male anorexia, which is not in the book. One of the moments that sticks out in my education at Lake Forest Academy was an English class I took my senior year. It was AP English with Mr. Eliff, who we were reading A Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. And he told us this, or read us, I think, something from an interview, basically saying that this whole book, which is this multi-generational, really intense saga of the South, started with Faulkner's image of a girl up in a tree. There is a scene with a girl up in a tree, but it's on page 200 something, and it just kind of, it's beautiful, but it just kind of goes by. And you would never think that that's where this book grew from. You would never think that was the seed. So it is really fun, to me at least, to hear then for authors what that was and how it came to be. But it's also really just fun to talk and to answer questions and to have sort of a back and forth. So I would love to do that. Things about writing, things about this book in particular, things about the publishing process, which is always a fascinating conversation, I think, for those of us who love to read. And for myself, I didn't know anything about publishing until a few years ago. Got the crash course. Do we have anyone want to start with some questions? Yeah.
I've heard you talk before, and for your first book, you said that you went through a couple different covers.
Yeah.
And now this is not the same cover that I have on my book.
Right. So this is the paperback cover.
Oh.
So very often, there's this interesting. Basically, hardcovers and paperbacks are sort of marketed to different audiences. For paperback, you want broader commercial appeal. And hardcovers tend to be sold to more serious readers. And not that, I mean, I think everyone in this room is probably a serious reader, and we all buy plenty of paperbacks. But it's really important that the hardcovers sort of speak to the literary people who might pick something up and write a review. And with paperback, you want broad appeal. So basically, the switchover, with my first novel, the cover stayed the same from hardcover to paperback. And that that was fine. I think it was a really successful cover that covered both of those. With this one, it's actually a nice sign that they've invested the time in doing a separate paperback cover, because it means they feel like it has broader potential and like it's worth reinvesting in it. Kind of, the idea is it'll catch the eye of different people, which is nice. So yeah, but I think every author I know has all these photos on their phone of like all the rejected covers for everything, which is hilarious. There's do you guys know the novel Seating Arrangements by Maggie Shostad? So I recommend it. It's a wonderful novel about a woman, kind of a wedding in Martha's Vineyard in the summer, but it's a literary novel, all the things that happen there. And so it's called Seating Arrangements, which is a lovely name. And the original cover was kind of a woman sitting on a beach, and it was basically her rear end, like seating arrangements. It was completely inappropriate to the book. She's wearing a swimsuit sitting on the beach, had nothing to do with the story. So we kind of basically, writers keep these on their phones to show each other so we can laugh about them. I didn't have any horrible ones for these, but the background here used to be blue. We went through a lot of different versions until things were done. Yeah.
So is it the publishing company that comes up with the artwork, and then how much say do you have in the final?
Some authors have no say in their cover, so you should never hold an author responsible for their cover. It's written into my contracts that we do have right of refusal and veto power. But it would be very foolish of me to go in with my own ideas. They have a whole department with people who've done this a million times, and what the author thinks the cover should be is very seldom what the cover should actually be. Fortunately, it's just a matter of maybe fine-tuning and tweaking. Like originally, the leaves were way too symmetrical, and it really bothered me, so that was the one thing I asked them to change, and so they did. Yes?
How has the e-book industry affected things like book covers? Because when people are buying them online, I don't feel that you get the same sensations when you're in bookstores.
Yeah, no, you don't. I don't think they've affected the way covers are done particularly. The thing that's happening with ebooks is ebook sales have really plateaued and are even dropping in proportion to paper book sales, which I think is good news.
Yes.
You just don't retain as much from an ebook, and I think this book in particular, because it moves backwards in time, it is a complicated book. I'm asking you to think, when you read it. And I've had people say to me, I tried reading it as an ebook and I was completely lost, so I went and I got the paper copy and now it makes sense. I have places where, that those moments, a book is meant not necessarily to be read one page at a time, but for you to flip back, remember the thing that happened. And this book in particular is like that. Things happened in 1929 that completely changed your understanding of what had occurred in 1999, and you need to be able to go back to that. Or to say, oh, I recognize that name. Yes, it's the same person who was here in the 50s. And so we, and all the testing that they've done, like with students retain information so much better from a physical book than from an ebook for whatever reason. So I'm happy that that's plateaued, and it's not, it's also, ebooks are very rarely good for independent bookstores, and independent bookstores are really huge for authors, especially authors who aren't just going to put out blockbuster after blockbuster. Bookstores are who bring us into tour. They'll put a book in someone's hands. They'll introduce you to a new audience. So I'm really glad that I think people have kind of, it's I think going to stay just about where it is. It's great for some things. If you were stationed in Afghanistan, you want a Kindle with you, right? You're not going to lug a backpack of books. That's great. but for my bookshelf, I want actual paper books. Yeah, Maureen.
Can you give us a little bit of background of your inspiration for some of the characters? Because there were some very eccentric characters.
Yeah.
So it's great we heard about the setting and the house.
Sure.
And you do mention Highwood in your book. So,
Yeah.
But maybe some of the characters.
That's a great question. I don't base characters on individual people I know.
Sure you don't.
What's really funny is I think for people who aren't writers, I think that's the assumption is that you must not. I don't think I know any writers who actually base characters on real people. They might say, it's a little bit like my mom. And maybe there are some writers who do, but it's more like what I can liken it to is, if you have a dream, and there's someone in your dream who's not someone you really know, but it's maybe like a quarter your uncle, and a quarter Pat Sajak, and a quarter Dracula and and this person's doing their own things. So for me, if I based someone on a real human, I find that very limiting. I think I started off, in high school and college trying to do that. And the problem with writing that way is then you're not free to take characters in directions that person wouldn't go. It's very hard to make them really your own. So I will say though, and I'll say this is a sort of a place where this happened, but it didn't work. I'd originally really wanted to put Georgia O'Keeffe in the story and to have her be in residence in the 1920s at this artist colony. And she would show up and it was this big deal, and it didn't work. I had a really hard time writing about, and I was using her name. It felt really limiting. I couldn't have her fall in love. I couldn't have her run away. Not that I needed her to do those things, but the fact that I couldn't felt very limiting. And of course there are writers who write about, historical figures and bring new life into them. But it just wasn't working. So what I did was I ended up folding actually 3 characters together. And so there's an artist in the 1920s named Zillah, who is largely Georgia O'Keeffe, and partly the poet Marianne Moore, who was originally going to be in there, and partly this original character who was just no one at all, Zillah, a Silverman character that I made up. So there are elements of her life, this photographer husband, and the fact that she always wears black or white, that are Georgia O'Keeffe, but it's just this very small part. I will, and others, what I'll do is, it's not basing the character on someone, but maybe just a detail. I stayed at an artist residency once with someone who always just wore his bathrobe everywhere. And in this book that turned into this, in the 20s, a poet who, or a fiction writer who's always wearing sort of a silk robe. But other than that, they have nothing in common. But I will say that there's a dog in this book. This is what I always tell people. I've never based a person on someone, but the dog in this book, there's this really aggressive poodle with bad breath who jumps on you in the first section, and I based that on my high school boyfriend's mother's poodle, but I changed. Who I hated. I changed the name. The dog's name was Hugo, so I changed it to Hidalgo. I don't think, even if this woman reads it, I don't think she'd recognize her dog. Yes.
Rebecca, would you talk about your experience with publishers and especially trying to find a publisher when you first started out?
Sure. It's not usually the author's job to find a publisher. It's the author's job to find an agent who then finds the publisher. There are exceptions. If someone's book is coming out with a small press, it works different for poets. Poets don't have agents. But if you're, to go with a big publishing house, the author's job is basically just to find an agent, which is a harrowing, long, weird process often. And it worked out for me. It was hopefully you just have to do this once. And so with my first novel, it was done. I thought it was done. I sent it to some agents and heard back that it was nice, but no thank you, and realized the revisions that I needed to do and stopped for a while. And in the meantime, my short stories were getting a lot of traction and were being anthologized. So I was in a much better position later. And also I had a much better novel eventually after I revised it some more. So I basically, before I'd had some agents contacting me, which was very nice, but before I wrote back to any of them, I felt like there was this one woman, sort of dream agent, who I would really love to work with. And so I thought, I'm just gonna email her and then she'll say no and then I can move on. And she actually ended up saying yes. So it's kind of the moment that made my career in terms of books, and I knew it at the time. Still really happy and excited about that, even though it was quite a while ago. And so it's the agent's job then to, agents are almost all in New York City. They have lunch every day with publishers. There's a lot of schmoozing going on. And they know what editors are looking for, what kind of books. They know who's ready to take on something new versus who's going through a divorce versus who's had too many of this kind of book recently. And the agent will send it out then to probably 10 or 12 very carefully selected editors after building up some hype about it. And then if you're lucky, one or more of them will make an offer. And in this case, we were very lucky with my first book. We had a lot of offers to choose from, which meant that we could go with, who I felt would be a really good fit. It's also, it's the best offer. And so then I've been at Viking, which is part of Penguin, since then. So it doesn't always work that way. There are other ways to do it, but that's pretty much the story. So it's really fortunate the writer isn't out there trying to sell their own book to editors or convince people to read it. It's there's a bit of that, but it's prior to that, and then hopefully it's done. Yeah.
In a corollary to this question and your very informative response, once you have been selected by, or your agent has found a publishing house for you, are all of your works bound by contract to go through that publisher?
No. They're basically sometimes you'll send a 2-book contract, but then that could be broken because you might not write the book or they might hate the book. I've never, for my first book it was 1 book, and then we did a 2-book contract with my novel and the story collection that will be out in June. But basically, very often it's that they buy the book and then they have right of first refusal on your next book, which means that you could refuse their offer, they could refuse the book, but they get to look at it before anyone else does. So that's how that goes. Maybe just a couple more questions, and then, yeah.
When did you know that you were going to be a writer, and did you have any other jobs before that process really took off?
Yeah, you can't graduate from college and go get hired as a writer. It doesn't really work that way, unfortunately. But no, I think I started writing when I was about 3 or 4, like as soon as I could hold a pencil. And my father was a poet. My grandmother was in Hungarian was a pretty well-known novelist, and so it was kind of always part of the culture of our family. And I just wrote all through school. Through grade school, I was writing plays, and I'd get my friends to be in them. I was making little poetry collections. I was writing stories, and it was, I think, around probably the year before I came to Lake Forest Academy. I first of all realized that not everyone keeps writing this much. A lot of people, just like we all start off drawing pictures, and then most of us stop for some reason. Everyone starts off writing little stories, and then most people stop. And that sort of occurred to me that this was a choice. This was a thing. It wasn't just the way you live your life. It's a choice of a thing to be. And that occurred to me right around the same time that I was getting some really positive feedback in school for my writing, and that sort of crystallized. And then by the time I got to Lake Forest Academy, I really wanted to be a writer, and had, fortunately, some amazing English instruction and English teachers who would assign creative work or let us do creative work as part of class. And got to do a lot of theater here, which I think really helps writers a lot to get inside a story and to get inside character. And then, majored in that in college. I taught elementary Montessori school for 11 years while I was working on short stories and as my first novel sold. And then very shortly after my first novel sold, I transitioned out of that. But I still, most writers also teach. And I do now, as you heard, since Suzanne introduced me, because it's possible to make a living by writing, but the problem is, I could work on my next novel for 5 years, and then it turns out to be terrible. And I don't want to publish it, or my publisher doesn't want to publish it, and then that's 5 years for which I just didn't get paid. So the stability of teaching is really nice along with that. Do maybe one last question, does that sound good? Yeah?
Have you sold the movie rights yet?
No. That's all.
What you did with your first? Did you
I can't really answer that question. So should we end on a question I can't answer? Maybe we'll do one more. There was one, you had one back there.
Yeah, you talked about starting with a short story and then setting it aside and coming back to it. But I was curious if you ever got to a point where you were stuck, and how you dealt with. I started the book.
Okay.
I'm a couple years into it.
Yeah.
And I pick it up and I put it down, and I pick it up and I put it down.
Yeah.
But can you?
Yeah, I mean, you get stuck all the time. I think, part of it is just work ethic and making yourself work. Part of it for me is always having more than one project going, so that when I'm stuck on one thing, I might be stuck for a good reason, because I might need a year to work it out. I can't always force yourself through being stuck, because then you might go to the easy solution. Whereas maybe it's something you really need to work out emotionally and intellectually, and you need time to do that. so then that might be then when I stop and work on short stories, or I put this novel aside and start another novel. And having more than one pot on the stove helps a lot. So you're always working, but there's something there. And then I've, over the years, kind of just developed ways to troubleshoot for myself. When I'm stuck, I'll draw big character maps. I'll draw a big arc for the plot, and things like that. So I've kind of developed my own specific troubleshooting mechanisms. Very often what gets people stuck is fear of some kind, and it is, once you're being published and people are excited about your work, it's a little easier to convince yourself that this is worth it. Your family's depending on you financially for this, so you really, you can't sit there just beating yourself up, you gotta work. I know people who get stuck for, I'll tell you, I'll do this, we'll end on this story because it's a story about Yaddo. I was there, and there's this wonderful writer named Kiran Desai, who's this Indian-American writer. She was sitting in the library at Yaddo one day, and the only place where there are public computers, and also the only place you can talk during the day. And I walked in, and she had her head in her hand like this, and looking at email, and I said, "Are you okay?" And she says, "What's the matter?" And she said, "I missed my deadline." And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, but how much?" And she said, "It's 6 years." So we'll end with that. But thank you all so much.
I wanted to say thank you to Rebecca for taking time out of her very busy schedule. Thank you for talking to us about the book. I loved it, and we're looking forward to your forthcoming work. I have a little gift for you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
She has a second as well. And thank you also to Suzanne and Sheila for organising this beautiful event. And see you all at the gala.